you survived an avalanche, like a real avalanche. And I would love to dive into that story because I think the audience will find that really fascinating. But first, like how did you quiet the mind in such a state of chaos?
First of all, my mind wasn't quiet initially in this avalanche. So we were on the 13th highest mountain in the world doing the first winter ascent. It's called Gasherbrum 2. It's deep in the heart of Pakistan, up on the border with India and China. And it's literally right on the line of control in the conflict zone, which is now in a ceasefire with India. So very remote place on the planet, only three of us. And we had been to the summit 2 days before on February 2nd. So this was in 2011. And then it was February 4th that we were leaving Camp 1, going back to base camp, and we got hit by an avalanche. It had been storming for 2 days. And so initially, when that happened, my mind was very not quiet. And because you're thrust into survival mode, and there's this sort of time dilation that happens where the brain is trying very hard to make sense of everything that's happening, specifically the imminent threat to your own survival. So, there's the survival instinct. What do I need to do in this moment? But also all these random crazy thoughts that sort of are like Polaroids flooding your mind of your life. And directly after the avalanche, I turned on the camera and I pointed at myself and I just sobbed because it was sort of this release of this deep fear, chaos, and sort of a searching for understanding. And I think in some ways that was my first attempt at quieting my mind in that moment, because in a very real way, the camera provides separation between you and something else. Even if you're pointing at yourself, you are engaging with an activity that requires some level of focus. And after that, there's this profound instinct to sort of get done. So you go into go mode, and I think there's a natural narrowing of the mind, but that's not to say that everybody experiences that. Many people go into complete, fight, flight, freeze, where their mind is just so jumbled that there's no way for them, there's no way to quiet it. But truthfully, it's just reconnecting to breath, assessing the situation, focusing on what you can change, and letting go of the rest. And I think that's allegorical for everything in life when we end up in these high intensity, high chaos, high vulnerability situations.
Yeah, and that was really back before like getting out of your comfort zone was cool. Like that was back before cold plunging, that was back before the saunas. And, a lot of people do that today to prepare for situations like that. You mentioned that was your first like real life experience and learning how to quiet the mind. Had you done anything, before, like meditation, breath work, to like work on that stuff before? Or you just that was your first time?
I mean, I had done some breath work, but it was when I was a lot younger. But I wouldn't say, I had climbed for a long time, and I had been in other catastrophic circumstances in my life in those environments that were, near death. I had taken a couple of very big falls in avalanches in the Canadian Rockies. This was not the first time, but I think, to your point, it was before this hyper focus culturally about like get out of your comfort zone, withstand discomfort, learn how to manage it, learn how to breathe through your nose. Those things were sort of already, I don't want to say innate, but they were deeply embedded in my psyche because, I started skiing when I was 2 and I started climbing when I was 5. So I had sort of a lifetime of experience of dealing with scary moments of high consequence that had required developing a skill set that would allow me in that moment to just focus.
And so what was it like walk the audience through like exactly what was happening during that avalanche? Because the way I see it, I'm like, you're like gripping like rocks and there's just snow like piling on top of you. Is that what it was like?
Well, so what's interesting is avalanches are obviously we know they're incredibly powerful, but there are multiple components to them. One of them that you bring up is debris in the debris. So things like rock and ice that you know can cause traumatic injury. And we were in what's called the deposit zone. So we were actually on relatively flat ground, and the avalanche came sort of from behind us and to our right, and it came off a mountain called Gasherbrum 5. And in the avalanche, there was a bunch of big blocks of ice. And so what happened was, being in that zone, the avalanche comes off the mountain and it's creating an air cloud that pushes out in front of it. And this is the kind of thing that in big avalanches snap, you know, full grown trees in half. So that the force of that wind blast is actually what picked us up initially and thrust us across this terrain with these huge chunks of ice in it. It threw us across a huge crevasse, which is, I think, somewhat miraculous that none of us went into the crevasse, but that's how much force you're getting pushed with. And it's just very, very chaotic. It's, you know, you get hit, you get lifted up, and then you start ragdolling in a way that it's very hard to make sense of what's up. It's similar to being in a wave. And so for anybody who's been out in waves and has gotten toppled by one, this idea that you can make sense of what is up is, it's a little bit not quite right. The only way that I was able to make sense of what was up is this sort of brightness that would occur as I was in the spin cycle. Also, one of the things that I remember was it's very loud, and yet your mind is somewhat quiet inside. So there's multiple things happening at the same time. And in avalanches, you're taught to sort of swim if you can. So I remember that instinct going into full effect: swim as hard as you can. And what that is designed to do is try to keep you on top of the snow. But you realize that the weight of your body is sucking you deeper and deeper into it, and it gets darker and darker and darker. And then as we started to slow down, there was this moment of brightness where I just sort of reached up, and I ended up on the surface. Well, I was buried, but my head and my arm were on the surface. So, and immediately thought afterwards, well, Simone and Dennis are dead. That's it. That's over. And they're buried and gone, and I'm going to pull on the rope, but I have nothing to dig with aside from my hands. And by the time I get to them, they're going to be dead. So there was that shock and coming to terms with that. But as it happened, all three of us were predominantly on the surface of the snow.
Damn, that's wild, man. You're lucky, obviously, to be alive. But what's fascinating is it wasn't just that. It was like you also had to deal with this, I guess, avalanche of life afterwards, where you had to deal with a lot of the mental health struggles that you had kind of been not running away from, because I know you had tried to deal with them, but you hadn't thoroughly addressed. So talk about like the beginning, like how you grew up, which I think is really fascinating, so that the audience can better understand some of these demons that you had to address after the avalanche.
Yeah, I think with this background, it makes a little more sense what happened, where my early childhood was actually really, really marvelous. My parents, we were a middle-class household, grew up in Utah. We were not wealthy by any stretch, but my parents worked, and my dad worked 7 days a week. My mom worked 6 days a week. And they were very passionate about the outdoors. And they felt like one of the best ways to raise children was to expose them to the natural world and let them explore. So my brother and I were brought up that way. And like I said, the early childhood was amazing. We went outside, we played hard, we learned how to ski, we learned how to climb. It was very full of adventure and exploration, and broken arms and, broken wrists, broken bones. And this is something that I've worked very hard to unwind as to exactly why it happened. But at the end of the day, it's less consequential why it's interesting to understand it, and it helps put a container around it. But our family dynamics started to unravel in a way that was focused mostly around my brother and I, where he was 2 years older. And as we grew into adolescence, that relationship got really violent. Me being the younger one, I was usually on the receiving end. But the interesting thing about that is that I think he was obviously searching to get emotional needs met. And one of the most effective ways he found to do that was, to pick a fight with me or beat me up. And for a long time, I was like, oh yeah, my brother beat the shit out of me growing up, which isn't entirely abnormal, by the way. This is not a black or white thing. But I also learned that, well, hey, when I get the shit kicked out of me, I get attention. And so on some level, I started to feed into that dynamic. And I would, and this is not conscious, but I very much believe that I was feeding into it. And so to fast forward a little bit, as this violence and this rage in the household really started to snowball, and it got very, very violent because we were growing into our adolescent bodies. My grades, I was a smart kid. I went to high school 2 years early, and he was too. And my grades started to sort of go down really quick. And I was diagnosed with clinical depression. I was put on medication, SSRIs, when I was 12. And then by the time I would have been a standard freshman in high school, my grades had basically dropped to failing, and I just stopped going. And it was that time that I got put in a psychiatric hospital where they started fussing with the medications again and decided ultimately that the best thing was to put me in a long-term care facility called Lifeline in North Salt Lake. And there I was diagnosed with bipolar 2. And what we understand about bipolar 2 is that most people with it, there's a genetic predisposition. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but quite often when you have trauma, things like violence in the home, it can trigger it. So most people with bipolar have some genetic history, but trauma is often the thing that contributes to its manifestation in the body. And now what we understand too is that bipolar is really a spectrum. So 1 and 2 are sort of older delineations. They were defined by 1 is where you have episodes of mania, and 2 is where you have episodes of hypomania. Mania basically can trip into psychosis. Hypomania is below that, but they're both not sustainable places. You're living at a very high speed and you can create a lot, but there's an inevitable crash. And so after that diagnosis, which very much to me took on a story of sort of brokenness, something was wrong with me. I ran away from the treatment facility 3 times, and I ended up on the street, basically. I wasn't, necessarily always sleeping on the streets. Sometimes that was true, but I was taken in by family friends sometimes, and then I'd leave. And yeah, so that was adolescence. So there's all of this. And in my book, The Color of Everything, I talk about this period. I talk about some of the things that happened during that time that continued to contribute to and exacerbate the existing trauma. So fast forward into my life and sort of my chosen trajectory, oftentimes people with these chaotic childhoods end up gravitating towards very high risk endeavors. And because I was always sort of taught that because this lived in me, if I didn't follow this very specific path, I was going to go crazy. And I think somewhat ironically, I was like, well, I know how to live crazy. So maybe if I live crazy, I can outrun it. And then when you get to the avalanche, I was 29 at that point. So I knew a lot about this stuff. I had basically spent most of my life in therapy, but people with a lot of this complex post-traumatic stress and a lot of childhood trauma and developmental trauma, when they have a major traumatic event, they're more likely to tip into an episode of acute PTSD. And so that was the trigger to that episode. The avalanche was. And that's when I really started to unwind. That's when I started to get into more addictive patterns, more, dissociative patterns. And so on one hand, my life, because of this photograph that I took after the avalanche and that being on the cover of National Geographic and it really thrusting my career upwards in both climbing and photography, my personal life really started to unwind. And largely, I was just living so far out of integrity. And yet I was putting forward this image of integrity that inner tension just grew and grew and grew, and life unraveled somewhat spectacularly a number of times where I would build, and then I'd burn it down, and then I'd build again and burn it down and build. And now looking back, I think of, God damn, how many things did I sabotage and did I destroy by virtue of both an expression of bipolar disorder, but also just not believing that I was really worth what I was creating.
Well, so after the avalanche, what was rock bottom for you? Like, what did life look like? You mentioned you started disassociating. I know, like, there was some like infidelity and some sex stuff. So was that rock bottom?
No, I would not call that rock bottom. I think, I was very unhappy. So you're right. There was infidelity. There was sexual addiction is a very, we can talk about that. I think addiction is an interesting term and sort of diagnosis to pick apart, but certainly maladaptive sexual behaviors, which also goes hand in hand with bipolar. There was a lot of anger, and then by keeping those secrets and using alcohol to sort of grease the wheels for them and quiet the mind at the same time, I ended up in this very, very dark place. I was photographing an article on happiness, of all things, with Dan Buettner, who started Blue Zones. And I was in a hotel in Singapore. And I remember, I'd just had a random hookup with somebody, and I was drunk, and I was like, something is so off here. And I was just like, I typed in rehab and started researching rehab, and passed out. And this is after like climbing Everest without oxygen and all of this, huge sort of snowball of success in my world. But then, so I would consider that a rock bottom, when I finally decided I needed to start digging into this. But then, and right before that, I think, and I've talked about this before, it's an interesting way to understand it, but I remember climbing Everest. I did it without oxygen in 2016, and I ended up summiting alone. There was nobody there. It was just me. And at least psychically, somewhere deep inside, I think I understood that I had exhausted my capacity to search outside of myself for some resolution. Like I was sitting on the top of the world and understood there was no place else I could go to get away from myself. And so I think of that in some ways as my ultimate rock bottom, which sounds so privileged, like, oh, you're sitting on the top of the world, cry me a river. Well, yes. And, there was literally nothing else I could do to get away from myself.
Wasn't there a point, and maybe this was before the avalanche, but wasn't there a point where you like went to school to become a pastor, and then you left the Christian community? Was that before or after the avalanche?
That was when I was 17. So, cause I was in this sort of quasi homeless state, and I ended up living with my aunt and uncle, and they were very Christian. And so I started going to church with them, and I found I found a very meaningful community at a time where I had none. And so I got deeply involved in that faith and decided that, well, maybe I should be a youth pastor. So I actually, and this is after dropping out of high school completely. So I applied to a college in California, a Christian school. And that was my, I'm going to become a youth pastor. And then it didn't quite fit. I knew it didn't fit, but I was trying pretty hard, and I was, deeply involved in this faith for about 4 years. And then it started to just it didn't work anymore, because at that point it wasn't it wasn't less about the community and more about the faith. And because I questioned the faith, I didn't stay with it, if that makes any sense.
That totally makes sense. There's so many parts of your story I want to unpack. And I think the first part is, you mentioned you had all of this anger when you started to have this acute level of PTSD and used alcohol to kind of drown that. Like, what were you, like, knowing what you know now about yourself, like, what were you angry at? Or who were you angry at?
Well, I think at the deepest level, I was just angry at myself, because I had this idea of sort of innate brokenness. And so I was mad at myself. I was mad at the world. I was mad at my brother. I was mad at my parents. I felt like, well, at least subconsciously, hey, if I'm valuable, why am I not being protected? And they were trying, but my interpretation of it was, I'm not being protected, so I must not matter. So there's a deep, anger, as I'm sure is very, it is a basal emotion, but it's also oftentimes a secondary emotion, meaning that it's built on top of pain or fear. And so I think it was really just pain manifesting as this external sort of rage. And that rage was channeled into a drive to do things that would at least outwardly project that I mattered in the world, that I did have value. And so I was using it to propel me. And in many ways, that was very, very effective. But ultimately, the value that I was getting from that anger, or that what I was creating through that anger, that pain, was also hollow, right? Because the external validation, as we know, I was sort of mistaking that for love. So I was just angry that that I was so up. And what I've, really started to realize, and part of what the book is so much about, is unwinding that story and realizing that was a story I was telling that wasn't, it was sort of keeping me trapped in this identity of brokenness.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. I mean, external validation is the ultimate trap, right? And I think what happens is, you said it beautifully, like people confuse external validation with love. And I think what happens, at least in my own experience, is whenever I've done things because I had a chip on my shoulder, which by the way works for a long time until it doesn't, like having a chip on your shoulder and being mad at the world can drive you to be very successful. But then one day you kind of run out of gas and you're like, you know what? I'm just so tired of doing the thing, feeling good in the moment, only to be let down the next day when you're like, crap, I have to get up and make myself feel good all over again. Like, how do you know what I mean? And it's like this ultimate slippery slope that I would say most people in their life face. And it's just a hard thing to grapple with. So, like, what was the path like for you to like transcend that and escape this trap of external validation that you had been in for almost your entire life, to now living a life full of like meaning and purpose?
I think after the avalanche, I think it took, that was 14 years ago, and it took, look, I'm still going to unpack and unwind and continue that journey, but it took about 12 years before I really started to understand that what was missing was not more, and what I needed was less. Meaning, I didn't need more external validation. I needed less of it to quiet my environment so that I could hear myself again. And what I heard was this sort of crying out. But that was precipitated by, we were training for a new unclimbed route on Everest, something that had never been done. We were trying to climb this route on the Northeast face without oxygen, my friend Topo and I, and COVID happened. So the season got canceled once, and then it got canceled again, but we had been training hard now for 2 years. And we decided to go to the 7th highest mountain in the world in Nepal, which was open at the time, to try a new route on this mountain called Dhaulagiri. And at base camp, I broke, and I had what's referred to as a mixed episode, a bipolar episode, where you've got this hypomania verging on mania with this absolutely soul crushing depression. And it's very hard to make sense of it because your mind is so fast. It can be so grandiose. And yet there's this desire, or at least for me, there was this desire to die, that, and I think what thrust me into that was the stress of trying to sustain this life of more, 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 bigger, better, faster, more. Look at what I've done. Now watch me do something else. And that ultimately, that deep inner knowing, that voice that I would blocked out for so long was telling me this doesn't work. And so I think that was a psycho-emotional response to a rejection of my own inner knowing that led me to that. And after that, I quit climbing, I quit taking photos, and I was just left in this emptiness, this hollowness where I could finally hear myself. But what I felt, and I think what so many people with addictive behaviors feel, is this emptiness, this void. And of course, I'd always been involved with therapy, so I was doing therapy, but I also started to look for alternate means of therapy, and one of the most powerful for me was psychedelic. I don't advocate that for everybody, but and I don't do a lot of it anymore. But really, all it did was put me back in touch with my heart. And we often talk about the heart as this sort of ethereal thing. We use it as a metaphor, but we're understanding more and more that our heart and the mirror neurons in our heart with our brains plays an integral part in emotion processing. So the way I view it is I've got my mind, which is my thinking center. I've got my heart, which is my sort of existence center. And then I have my body. And when I can unify all of those things, there's a sense of wholeness and wellness. And where there once was this deep inner void that I was trying to fill up with everything external, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing. What I feel now on a daily basis, even when I'm, still, navigating a spell of depression, even when I'm unhappy, there's a solidness to it that is just unshakable. And that's how I know things are going to be okay. And the truth is, I believe that was always there. And I think it's always there for everybody. We just lose touch of it. We just somehow become deaf to it.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at is you got to this place of acceptance and forgiveness for yourself, your past, people, situations, etc. Like, and a lot of people, I think, struggle to get there. Like, their life changes, their life gets better, and then the head trash stays there. The head trash of, oh my God, my past. Oh my gosh, all this trauma. Oh my gosh, these people. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I did X, Y, and Z. And it just keeps them stuck. They take like one step forward, two steps back, one step forward, two steps back, and they just never get ahead. What was that process like for you, given everything you've gone through?
You're absolutely right. I think, and this is one of the things that a lot of, therapists talk about, and certainly something that I've talked about, is that therapy sort of is a way to understand the what of things. Like, this is what happened. But so often, once we understand that, at least in my experience, there's a mistake. We conflate it. I conflated it, my understanding of it all, with healing it. And really what I was doing was getting trapped in the story of my past and recycling it over and over and over again, and telling these stories of trauma that, as much as I thought that was a release, it was actually just the very first step. And there were many more steps, part of those being psychedelics, part of those being letting go of the like, there was a space where I was like, I need to heal from healing, because healing itself becomes this seeking. And it's the sort of the seeker's dilemma, where we're always focusing outward, and, oh, there's going to be this place where I'm better. And that's not always the case. Yes, we reach a place, but that place is just another point on the journey. I started really, when I was writing the book, I started really looking into it and going, wait a minute, what's the difference between the hard data of what occurred in my life versus the story that I'm telling? And is it possible for what happened to just be something that happened? And can I let go of the story? And what stories am I telling? And how do I start to recognize those more and more and more? In fact, this was a light bulb moment that took me years to revisit. But I was in the gym. I started doing CrossFit to train, like for these big climbs. I would do a mix of endurance, cycling and running, and but then I'd go into the gym to build strength and resilience. And I was talking to a coach one day, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm just not strong at this stuff." And he just said, "That's a story." And I was like, and I was resistant to it at first. I was like, kind of in my head, I'm like, "Fuck you, man." But I started to pay attention to that. And again, it took years. And I was like, that is a story. A more that's an identity. I'm stuck. That's a definitive. And there's something else there that's potential, which is I haven't yet developed my strength, or I haven't invested the time to develop this piece of me, which is an open-ended journey that then I'm invited on. And I'm no longer identifying with weakness, but rather just giving the hard fact of, I haven't developed these skills yet, but I can. And so if you extend that into the totality of your life, all this stuff happened to me versus these are the things that happened. This is the way I understand it. And this is what I'm doing now. It's the difference between an identity and a journey.
This episode is brought to you by Live On Labs. If you are someone who is constantly stressed, feeling depleted, and exhausted, I have some exciting news. My friends at Live On Labs have an incredible deal I can offer you. When you buy any product at full price, you get a free carton of their highly popular B-complex product, which I take every day. Taking a B-complex supplement can also help support things like a healthy metabolism, increased energy, blood sugar balance, and learning. Vitamin B supplements can help replenish nutrients depleted from stress. Live On Labs puts years of research into each product, which is why I stand behind them. Using liposome encapsulation technology, these products promote elite absorption so the supplements get into your cells and give you the best benefits that you're looking for. Right now, you can get a free carton of Lipospheric B Complex Plus, which is a $56 value with any full price purchase from liveonlabs.com. This supplement has the B vitamins and minerals that you need to help turn food into sustained natural energy throughout the day. Just add B Complex Plus and any other full price supplement to your cart and enter code BOPES24 at checkout to get this amazing deal. Now back to the show. And I think it's hard to let go of our bias, right? And our ego. I heard you talk on, Rich Roll's podcast about how you started to, when you wrote your book, it was out of like pure anger, which I relate to when I wrote my first book. And then you were like bringing certain sections of the book, I think, to like members of your family to be like, is this true? And they're like, no. And you're like, yeah, you're probably right. And I remember doing the same thing when I wrote mine because I was so angry at the world, at at certain members of my family that I just felt it was like the right thing for me to do. But I also still had this personal bias towards the situation. And I think that, there's a saying, I guess, in the self-help community that like, everybody has their truth, right? Which I think I agree with a caveat where sometimes your truth is wrong. Like, you know what I mean? I mean, you can feel that way, but you can also be like completely like oblivious to the fact that there's other people who see that in a totally different perspective. What have been like, what has been the journey for you to like unpack your ego and bias towards the way your life has turned out to get to this place where it's like, you know what? I don't agree with how people treated me, but that didn't happen.
Again, I think it, and we talk about this in the recovery community, which I'm no longer engaged with, but it's one of the things that I, take what works and leave the rest behind. But this unflinching honesty, where if we're brave enough, we can ask these hard questions. And the answer can be, no, I'm not ready to let go of that yet. And that's fine. So long as you're aware that you are holding on to something. And the more I started to ask those questions, the more I saw, this is what I'm holding on to. And the more I flexed that muscle of being willing to ask the hard questions, the more truth was illuminated. And I'm talking about, a big T truth. I think what you were referring to is sometimes your truth is wrong. I would say it's not that your truth is wrong, because that's just what it is. It's that you're choosing a truth, right? And so the facts might remain the same, but the story you're telling about it is creating a belief that then we're interpreting as truth. And so the more I was willing to go, well, wait a minute, I remember, and this is, I think, what I talked about with Rich was, you know, I because I was still seeking my brother's approval and his love, I was writing things that were like little like bait hooks, like hoping that someday he'd read it or somebody would say, hey, I read this and your brother was saying this, and then it would draw him back to me. And what my mom, I let her read one of these chapters, who, by the way, was so scared of this book at first. I said, I'll always love my brother the most. And she's like, that doesn't feel honest to me. And I was like, it's not. I'm still seeking his love. And that was a light bulb moment too, where it was like this invitation to go deeper into everything that I was saying. And as I started to edit this and like sift through it, I was like, holy, I am speaking as such a victim here. I'm so disempowered. And I thought that, this process was empowering me. But what I'm really seeing is, oh my God, I'm giving up all my power by adhering to old stories that are creating beliefs that keep me trapped.
Yeah, and people get trapped by so many beliefs about themselves and about their story. And one of the other things that I think can trap people is like identifying with their mental illness, right?
Totally.
I think having bipolar is very stigmatizing. I mean, just for the way you describe and what, not only for the way you describe and what it actually entails, but also like one of the first things somebody says when somebody is like angry or somebody's moody is like, oh, they're just bipolar. You know what I mean? And they don't even understand like what being bipolar actually looks like and what it is. But you have like a legitimate like medical condition where you've been diagnosed with a mental illness. How have you been able to not let that like kind of handcuff you and not let it like just limit you in what you've pursued in life?
Part of that is, for the way I think of diagnosis and all of this stuff is that first, I say this in the book, psychology is an invitation out of victimhood and not into it. And diagnoses are just words that help us understand a set of behaviors that are identifiable, right? And all of these things lie somewhere on a very broad spectrum. There's 8 billion people on the planet, and they're all going to represent and present differently. But all a diagnosis is a container. And that container is comfortable because it helps us help me understand the behavioral patterns. But to your point, there was this identification with it. And in that, I was also hiding behind it. And there was almost a belief of like, I'm up that I'm special, and again, in the recovery communities, we talk about people wanting a gold star for living a normal life. And my experience was that I would almost manipulate the world around me by virtue of being sick. And I started to look at that and look at the story of sickness, and started to, back to the previous question very seriously why I was doing that. And did a diagnosis actually contain me to a specific way of life? You see this all the time these days because we're learning words like trauma. And this is this whole conceptualization. We're learning about trauma. We're learning about narcissism. And we hear all these beautiful, wonderful sound bites all over Instagram and TikTok. ADHD. All of a sudden, everybody has ADHD. Everybody was with a narcissist. Everybody, and it's like we're cheapening those words for both the people that actually struggle with them. And there's this tendency to be like, well, I'm ADHD, so that's why I can't do these things. No, you have a set of behaviors that makes other things more challenging at times, but that does not mean you're trapped in that. And to stay trapped in it with all the incredible resources and tools we have does at some point become a matter of choice. It doesn't mean that you're choosing to be that thing. It doesn't mean you're choosing to have ADHD or bipolar. It doesn't mean that at all. What I hear in those things is people trying to explain what hurts. And I think a more beautiful question is, why do I hurt? And if we can start to get to those things, if I could start to get to those things and address them, I found that I was less inclined to be identified with trauma, with diagnosis, with addiction, with whatever it was, because I was actually listening to what hurt and giving that a voice and caring for it.
You said earlier that you're still unwinding like a lot of the trauma and a lot of the stuff that you're learning about yourself, and that you've kind of gotten to this place where you have acceptance and forgiveness around a lot of what's going on in your life. And you seem like somebody who's just an avid learner and a searcher, somebody who wants to continue to learn and search for things that can help you. What are some of the habits that you do on a daily or weekly basis, or habits that you don't do, either one, that allow you to like tame the bipolar, to tame the mental health stuff, tame like some of those old demons that might creep in?
I mean, it's just, I think of it as like living alongside them with love, with compassion, with a generosity, with a recognition, with a making space for them, and without identifying with them. But I have sort of a list of things that I do, and I try to hit them every day. And sometimes I don't. And that's part of the, I'm still unpacking, unwinding. I'm not this, I'm not a Huberman where I'm optimizing my day. I don't, it's like, sure, you can wear blue blockers and, do a cold plunge and whatever it is, all these things throughout your day. But if you're still lying and hiding a whole bunch of shit, those are the bigger problems that are actually impacting your psychobiology. Right. So it's funny. It's like the old thing where people are like, oh, grip strength is like, that's going to give me longevity. So I'm going to sit on the couch, eat potato chips, and use a grip strength. Like, no, the grip strength is indicative of a bigger thing. And so to build the bigger thing, I meditate, I move, I read, I journal, I find a way to give, to be of service. I try to create on a daily basis, so engage with some level of creativity. I focus on purpose, work, right? And then I spend time with community. So those are my 8 things that if I can address or engage in some small way on a daily basis, I notice that I am healthier, and, to use sort of a catch-all term, happier. The other thing that I found very important for me is scheduling and discipline. I think so often people think that discipline is a trap. I think discipline is freedom. And I will be very honest that even knowing all of these things and having this roadmap, there are days where I don't do any of them. And rather than kicking the shit out of myself for those days, I just notice, oh, I really don't feel very good. And it's avoiding things too, but it's not prohibitive of, depending on your makeup and your relationship with things like substances, with, porn, with any of these things that are hyper stimulating. Certainly I feel better when I'm not doing any of those things, but I also have tried very hard to remove the shame around them and the hiding around them. And this is one of the issues that I see so often with like addiction is there's so much shame around that label that when we're identifying as an addict, I think, at least for me, in a psychic sort of deep way, I was engaging with the shame. And so that's just an example.
And I think one of the hardest things to kind of encounter and go through is is not just rekindling relationships with family, it's also like how do you act with compassion? How do you get along with people that you believe, either attempted to destroy your life or just treated you a certain way that was incredibly mean or poor or whatever? And like, how do you reconcile all that? And I know your brother, for instance, you guys butted heads a lot when you were kids, and it was essentially like the catalyst for you like going away, right? Like, what's your family dynamic like now?
The family dynamic actually is really beautiful. My mom and I are very, very close. My dad, who's in the process of making the big exit, is just he's a wonderful guy that we've repaired all of it. We've gotten beyond it, and that took me stepping into it and stepping outside of the stories, stepping outside of my own victimhood. My brother and we're not close. We don't really talk, but I think that does not mean that there's not love there from both sides. I think there is. One of the biggest shifts that I've had that has helped with all of this, and I know people talk about gratitude all the time, and I think it's very, very hard for some people to grasp. It was for me. It wasn't until I did a ketamine therapy that I was like, oh, that's what gratitude is? Oh, I didn't even know. I didn't know. And as I've gotten further into the journey, it's like there's the ability for me to step back and, using my brother as an example, I'm so grateful for that relationship. I'm so profoundly grateful for him because, as you point out, that relationship is what thrust me onto this journey. It's what created so much of the tumult that ultimately was so unbearable that I had to investigate. I had to go inside. And so he's my greatest guide. And I love him for it. I love him. And I, depending on how cosmic you want to get, there's some piece of me, I think, that believes that like I chose that. And I'm not saying we choose our abusers. I want to be very careful there. I'm just saying there's some piece of me that believes that there was some level of like, deep subconscious engagement with it that allowed me to go on this incredible journey. And I use that template often as a way to reframe discomfort, reframe sadness, reframe pain, because ultimately at the end of the day, like I'm alive and I have a body and I have a mind, and this mind is incredible and it's done beautiful things. And sometimes it's a little, sometimes it's a little tricky to navigate, but I'm making this my own, but I heard it once, people are always talking about their glass being half full or half empty, or, and the step back is, man, but what a glass,
What's been like the one thing or the two things that you've still got issues with as far as working through that still kind of creep up and that you're like, man, I wish I could just stop doing this, or I wish that would go away?
Well, discipline is a hard one. I wish I was more disciplined. I wish I kept a tighter schedule, not to keep me in line, but to free me up. I struggle with that because there's a profound resistance to it. And alongside that is a profound ability to procrastinate, because I still experience a deep degree of overwhelm at times. And a very effective short-term coping mechanism is to procrastinate. It's not an effective long-term because it just builds the stress, right? But those are two things that I and they go hand in hand. I still have addictive qualities where, I use nicotine. I've mostly put like the sexual stuff to bed, but it pops up in its own ways at times, not through infidelity, but things like, just be honest about it. Porn is a huge one that so many people struggle with. And that one is mostly, put to rest. But, these things pop up. And for me, it's just about like, I think the mindfulness that a meditation practice that I go in and out of, but a mindfulness around these things and a reduction of shame around them. That's how ultimately over time you stop taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You start taking you stop taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. You start taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So you still are making progress, but it's not, for most people, it's not this like, oh, everything resolved itself. It just doesn't work that way. It takes, for me, it's taken a lot of consistency, resilience, resistance, and it takes sort of falling back sometimes to remember, God, I really don't like how this feels.
And you've been on this journey for a while, and you said it took you some time to finally realize that like you're the problem, right? Or you're at least a big part of the problem, and that you have to like figure out what's going on. And there's a lot of people right now, like you mentioned porn, there's a lot of people that are like lonely. And so they're turning to things like porn. They're turning to things like substances and other addictions. And there's a lot of people right now that feel like trapped in some sort of mental health thing, or they feel trapped in an addiction, or just trapped and feel like there's like the only way out is just to like somehow just keep taking it day by day, but they still don't see like light at the end of the tunnel. Like, what is your advice for somebody like that?
Well, first of all, I didn't get this for a long time. I heard one day at a time so often, but that's all it really is. You don't have to quit forever. Just quit today. And I didn't learn how to embody that for a long time. The other thing that I've found really helpful is when I'm engaged in those activities, whatever they happen to be, and I feel that tick of despair, I actually try to memorize it. I try to go so deep into that moment that I'm anchoring the despair. I'm not anchoring myself in despair. I'm anchoring the despair as a feeling, as a sensation, as an experience that I can remember when I want to do these things again. So I can actually recall like that deep sense of hollowness, of isolation, of pain that I feel when I'm engaged with activities that I memorize it so that I can call it back and go, I know that's what's waiting for me. I know that's what's on the other side of doing this, and I don't want that. But the tricky thing about all of this is, I don't know if you've ever read Siddhartha.
I haven't. I'll have to add it to the list.
It's so great. But the last chapter, it's a quick read, 100 pages. But the last chapter is sort of Siddhartha. He's sitting there and he's come to this place of, equanimity and calm in his life. But, and his old friend returns and he said, he's like, what have you learned? And he basically says, look, man, I don't trust teachers. I don't seek. He's like, part of this is that he says, look, wisdom is not something that can be taught. Knowledge can be taught. And the more we seek, the more knowledge we have. And the more knowledge we have, oftentimes the more lost we become, because it creates a sense of frustration that I know all these things, but I can't seem to break them. And his whole thing is like, look, wisdom is engaging with what you already know. And it's oftentimes so much simpler than what we make it. And it's living in that and it's embodying it. And so you can't teach that. You can only teach knowledge. And I really love that because I think it frees people up from like, I know all this stuff, but that cognitive dissonance of like, I know all of it, but I can't do it. But it's like, well, yeah, it takes time and it takes repetition.
Last thing I wanted to kind of get into, because I think it's important to talk about, is I do think that there is like, I've talked about a lot, and you've talked about like the importance of not falling into the trap of external validation. I think external validation, there's a certain level that is healthy, right? Like there's feedback with that where you understand like, oh, I'm getting somewhere. Or, just some of us are just driven differently, but how have you learned to separate like the desire for external validation from actually like from actually like just having a healthy level of it?
Well, I mean, you raise a really good point. You know, validation is oftentimes tied to healthy validation is oftentimes tied to acceptance and belonging. And that's essential to our survival, right? We're social animals. So we want to generate that validation in order to feel like we belong and we're safe, and we're going to survive. What I've tried to understand and lean more into is the different kinds of external validation that come at us. Social media validation is not one that does anything. It's actually almost the opposite. It 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 sort of perpetuates, because it's a bottomless well, like, oh, I'm just going to eat up the likes, you know, I'm going to eat it up. Everybody's saying nice things about a photograph I took. Everybody's telling me how great I am. That's all vacuous. I have never found that to be sustainable or even very meaningful. I mean, I appreciate it all. I thank you, but that's not really a meaningful source. The kind of external validation that I tend to pay attention to is community driven, where I'm engaging me on a meaningful level with the people that mean the most to me and listening to how they're giving me feedback. That to me is like, oh, okay. Like you're not fluffing my ego. All those sort of more vapid forms of external validation are very much ego driven, where my experiences in my community, when I'm listening to the positive feedback and the negative feedback, what I'm feeling from those people is actual care and a sense that I'm got. And that is powerful, powerful medicine.
Well, Cory, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, for your wisdom, everything that you shared. My audience is going to get a lot of value out of this.
Thank you so much for having me. I love these conversations. They're so fun because I end up learning. When you ask so many great questions, I'm thrust into a position of having to articulate things that I haven't thought about in the context that you're offering them, and it's so meaningful. So I'm very grateful on a very honest, deep level that I am given the time to try to figure these things out. I'm still very much on that journey.
Well, you got it, man. And thanks again for coming on.
Talk to you soon, man. Later.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.